This week on Hope City Overtime, we take a look at the story of Eutychus, that kid that fell out of the window because his pastor preached too long. This is one you're going to want to like and subscribe, especially if you fall asleep in church all the time. Let's get it.
Welcome to Hope City Overtime, a weekly podcast where we take a little more time to dive into Sunday's message. And I am sitting here with our expression pastors and our lead pastor. And this week, we moved past Jesus in our Wake the Dead series. I mean, Jesus is all over all of Scripture, but to the early church where we saw an incredible story of the Apostle Paul, who was preaching to a room full of people. And he preached a really long time, and Eutychus got tired, and that's where we start our story. So before we get into some rich theological content, I've got a table full of pastors. I want to hear the best story of a time that you could barely stay awake, or that you were speaking and can remember someone not being able to stay awake through your message.
So many to choose from.
Right.
I feel like I grew up in church tired. Oh, man.
I'll jump in with one. And unfortunately, I was one of the sleepers in this particular situation. We were at college. We were in our college, we actually had chapel services every day. And we had
Every day?
Every day.
Wow.
And we had a new president that came in, and he was speaking at pretty much every service. And this, it's the middle of the year, so everybody's in the middle of classes and all this kind of stuff. And all I remember is falling asleep as I every once in a while would do at chapel. And I just remember waking up to hearing him screaming a line from Dumb and Dumber at the top of his lungs. And everybody kind of like startled out of their slumber, like, oh my gosh, this just happened.
Is this Rutland?
It was.
No way.
We're all out cold. Well, I shouldn't say we all. A lot of people were asleep, and all of a sudden he just yelled,
Was it
all of
extra
our pets'
warm?
heads are falling off. And everybody was like, what? And then he just went right back to a sermon.
That's
Interesting. Was it warm? Like, was there something in the room that day that was different, or do you think everyone was just tired?
Yeah, because it wasn't normal for me to fall asleep.
The lights were flickering.
Yeah, definitely. There were oil lamps burning.
Yeah. What about you guys?
Man, I can't think of a specific time. I fell asleep more in school than at church. It was tough, though. I'm not going to say his name just because, but like our senior pastor, like it was tough at times for me to stay with him. The monotone, his voice just got monotone, and he would lose me. But yeah, I don't recall sleeping much in church.
Did you ever sleep so hard at school that you drooled on the desk?
Mm-hmm.
And you got to wipe it off with your elbow?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No?
I wouldn't even go to sleep at like sleepover parties because I am paranoid about what will happen if I'm not in control of the situation. So I'm not a public sleeper. Yeah, that's just a little insight into the neuroses of my mind.
We used to be put on the stage every Sunday. As a part of my first pastoral position, I was the associate youth ministry coordinator. And I was placed on the stage on Sunday in my suit that was probably 2 sizes too big for me. And the fight was always, like, we would sit on the stage while the pastor was preaching. And we were behind him. Yeah. So he didn't see us sleep, but everybody else did. That was so tough. I used to get off the stage and people would just be laughing at me. Couldn't keep it awake this time, huh? Hernandez? Like, it was bad.
I was praying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My spiritual language sounds like snoring, so just ignore it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that I've ever fallen asleep in a situation like that, but I have been speaking when someone front and center fell asleep. And this was before I was a pastor. It was when I was early on going around to raise support to go overseas. And I'd been invited into this church to speak to a women's group. And I did not speak often. Like, I still get a little nervous now sometimes, but I was so nervous. And then I'm sitting up there, and literally the woman in the middle of the front row is out within probably 5-10 minutes. And I'm just freaking out in my head the whole time. And she ended up coming up to me afterwards and apologizing. She had just had a medical procedure. She probably shouldn't have come, but she was like, I was actually really excited to hear from you. And so it was fine. I wasn't traumatized by it, but it was humbling to be.
I tell you what, man, when you slept as much as I did in church, man, that pastor saying bow your head, close your eyes at the end was guts.
Lord.
It was like a manna from heaven.
It was.
Yeah. Or it just meant it was going to be harder to stay awake.
That's right.
Yeah. But so this is where we find Eutychus in our story. I thought you did a really phenomenal job of kind of helping people understand the fullness of who he was. Will you talk a little bit about what was likely going on to lead up to this moment where he, spoiler alert, falls out a window?
Yeah, as I was kind of reading through some stuff, that was one of the things that I kept coming across, that more than likely, since it said this was the first day of the week, that it most likely wasn't the Sabbath. Most likely a Sunday, and a lot of people attributed that's how the early church, this is why we adopted Sundays, because it wasn't the Sabbath, which meant that was probably a work day for him. And so, again, I don't know what he did or whatnot, but I'm assuming he put in a full day of work, and then you show up to church, and it's really hot up there. You're 3 stories up. There's no AC.
It's
There's
flickering lights.
Yeah, and on top of that, the flickering lights were oil lamps. So there's it's like a room full of candles that's burning and the smoke coming off. And I ended up saying the word stagnant yesterday, and that really, as soon as I said it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's it. It just felt so, it must have felt so stagnant in that room with no wind, no air movement. And here's the thing, everybody else probably worked a full day too, which meant it probably stunk up there,
Yeah, that's probably true.
just stuffy. So that's
He
why
probably fought to get that spot in the
Right.
window with a little bit of fresh air.
Well, that was the
and-
thing. Apparently the windows were probably much larger, and that probably was the only spot that there was any type of airflow. So
Yeah. So poor Eutychus falls asleep, falls out the window. Is it second story, third story? I can't remember.
Third
but
story.
And he falls to his death. Scripture's really clear. He falls to his death. But then what we see is that Paul goes down and he touches him. And does he hold him? I can't
Yeah, he took him
remember.
into his arms.
Took him into his arms and says he's alive. And one of the things that came up as we were preparing for this is a pattern that we see over and over again. Paul comes to this man who has died and he gathers him up in his arms. We see Jesus constantly in these stories going and touching people, saying they're just sleeping. Why is it a big deal that there's always some element of physical touch in these stories, particularly in this Jewish context that Paul was in and Jesus was in, and then we'll move on to beyond that.
Yeah, so Mosaic law, according to Leviticus, we see a pretty stern not Leviticus, Numbers. We see a pretty stern warning as to how to navigate dead things. The objective was not to touch them, that anybody who touched anything dead was then considered ceremonially unclean. Now, there was a process for purification, but really the thought was just don't touch it. Just don't touch it. We see actually other stories in Scripture where people come into contact with dead things, and there's a procedure. Samson was famously kind of messed up because of his flippant way of navigating a dead carcass. So that very much became a part of the Mosaic tradition, the Jewish law, in order to help people avoid those spaces. Now, from a very practical place, sometimes we read these laws and we immediately go some zero, spiritual. But the truth is, from a very practical place, death harbors disease. Mm-hmm. If something is in that carcass that's kind of created that scenario, you don't want it. Like, be careful of contamination. So they were very clear, like, this is what it looks like to avoid death. So then when you read all of these stories of these men of faith touching dead things, I mean, it does definitely make you question what's happening. Are they willfully disobeying this law? Are they trying to redefine it? Like, what's really kind of happening here? Because it's one thing if it happened once. In every one of these stories, there's some form of physical contact.
Yeah. So I know, like, everyone kind of was along the lines when you preached of some people think this, some people think this. For the sake of the conversation, knowing that we all have a lot to learn, where are you kind of landing as you've processed through some of this, prayed about it? What do you think is going on in these situations, particularly with Jesus reaching out and touching what we know to be dead bodies?
Yeah, I've never struggled theologically with the thought that Jesus is redefining the law. Matter of fact, often when we read through the New Testament story, Jesus is very quick to be like, you know that the law says this, but I say this. And we really have no problems with the way he reframes it there. So I really do think that what Jesus is doing in this moment is not just reframing the law, but I think what's bigger than that is he's literally changing the dynamics of how we approach death and what death can do. I think sometimes when we read, this goes hand in hand with the idea of sleep. He moves the needle from death being this infinite final thing to, no, they're only asleep. Those things go hand in hand. So I do think he is redefining the boundaries of death and letting us know we don't have to be afraid.
Yeah.
I think something I came to with that too was reading that culturally they saw anything that had to do with death as in opposition to God. If God is life, then anything with death was the opposite of God. And so it kind of makes sense that they felt that they needed to have this purification or sanctification process. And I love that in that picture, Jesus is that process. So you talk about that redefining. He is that process. And so now that connection to life doesn't matter with the death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, I remember raising this question in sermon prep a couple weeks ago, just being like, what about purity laws? Like, we have all these stories and we know that people weren't supposed to do this, but Elisha is doing this. Elijah is doing this. Then we see Jesus doing it. And I do think it goes back to that idea of wake the dead, that it is a redefinition, particularly with Jesus. Like,
Yeah.
because he's the one who ends death. Like, even though that hadn't happened yet when he was in his ministry, he knew what was to come. Like, he's God, he's outside of time and also fully human. And just let your mind be baffled by all of that for a minute. But this idea of like, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. Even when his disciples got confused because he was referring to Lazarus as asleep, and then he was like, I'm going to say it really plainly so you understand, Lazarus is dead. But he was also saying that he was asleep, that there's this finality that he just does away with.
Yeah.
So that it's not that he's stepping into this unclean situation. He's Jesus, so he makes it clean because he steps into it. It's hard to get your mind around.
Yeah.
But it's really cool because what he does to us too, right? Like in our places where we're unclean, Jesus steps in and makes us awake. So you talked about the this idea of people who wake the dead, touch the dead. And then everyone shared stories about things that they're afraid of, except for Pastor John. You shared a story about being in a situation where other people were afraid. So I think it would be a great opportunity for you to come clean today and talk about something that you've been afraid to touch.
It's a good question.
We got frogs
Yep.
and possums / raccoons a little bit.
A little bit.
No, I'm afraid of heights to some degree. But even then, like I've bungee jumped. And
Wow.
I'm not afraid. Like, I'm trying to think now. I mean, I'm sure there's things I'm afraid of, like venomous snakes. But like, I've had a pet snake that wasn't venomous, so I'm not afraid of that.
Alligators.
Alligators, I'm afraid. I'm petrified of alligators. I will not go swimming in water if there's a possibility that there's a gator. That's a good one.
Wisdom.
People not from Florida, I don't know, understand.
No, they don't get it.
this.
They don't get it. Fort Lauderdale is called the Venice of the United States of America. I don't know if you know that.
No.
Because there's so many canals. And so there's a really good chance that you're going to, if you spend any time down there, you're going to walk in your backyard and there's going to be a gator. They're
Yeah, I
all
wouldn't like that.
connected.
That's why I stay far away from Florida.
Yeah.
Unless it's for a theme park.
And unfortunately, they're moving further and further north. So
That is true. You hear about them on North Carolina beaches a lot more.
yeah. So I do think I don't want anything to do with an alligator. That's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a possum story too. Like when I was kind of thinking, there was one night that I don't remember if I was in high school or college, but I was at my parents' house coming back in, making curfew, and there was a possum in the driveway. And so I called my parents from the car to be like, I want you to know I'm home on time, but I'm sleeping in my car tonight because there's a possum in the driveway, and I will not get out of this car until I know it has gone to sleep in the morning. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
I didn't. I think my dad came to my rescue or something. They were like, "You're being ridiculous. Come inside." But just like you, I will stay far away from a possum. And the point of that is we naturally know not to go near things that we're afraid of. But what we see in scripture is that people are going towards death. What does that mean for us in 2025?
It's a great question. That's a great question. I think many times we struggle with what we don't know. And so when you talk to people about death, who don't have a relationship with Christ, like legitimately, it is one of those questions that universally people struggle through. Like, what do I do? My grandmother died immediately. Now I'm thinking about what happens to her. And then now what happens to me, and what happens to those around me. So I think from one place, literal death, I think what Jesus is trying to communicate, I think later on, Paul communicates and tries to instill in the early churches, we don't have to fear that no more, so that we can help people navigate this question that so many, I can't tell you how many times I've done funerals for people who didn't have a faith journey, and then I do funerals for people who do, and there really is a difference. It's not that there's not mourning, because there's mourning at both, but mourning quickly moves to celebration because there's a hope we found. But I do think that on the spiritual side of this, like when it comes to spiritual death that people are navigating, this means that we have to be willing to do life with people who haven't got it yet, people who haven't figured out their relationship with Jesus, people who are struggling through some of the ugly and dark things of life, and have kind of made death a part of their everyday journey. I do believe it's the call of the church to go to the highways and the byways. I don't know why that in particular story, that parable that Jesus communicates about the wedding feast keeps coming to mind, that there was those who invited, and the ones who were invited had it all together. These are the people that kind of belonged at the wedding feast. They were friends, relatives, co-workers, those type of things. And unfortunately, every one of them had an excuse why they couldn't come. And the master gets frustrated. He's like, go to the highways and the byways, basically find those who others have outcasted, find those who others are overlooking, and invite them in. And there's that physical invitation that I believe is important. So when we say touch the dead, you gotta be willing to do life alongside people. You have to be willing to invite people to get close, to invest in people, and not live in this isolated place that we tend to live in.
I don't want to cut off if anyone else had something.
Well, that's where I was going to go with it. Was the second part of that sermon point was the isolation. I know the warning was out there about the possibility of sin affecting us, the same as it's affected them. But I love that point was, if you're in isolation, there's no point for the warning.
Yeah.
If we're living in community like we need to be, that's when we can be affected. But that's also when we can be effective.
Yeah.
If you're living in isolation, like...
Well, it was like this morning. My wife is smarter than me, so she always looks at the weather. And I'm getting ready, and I was like, does this shirt work? She's like, yeah, it works fine, but just know you have to prepare for the rain. Like you got to wear something for rain. So the caution was, you are going to be in the rain. Make sure you have something on that protects you from the rain. If she thought I was never going to be outside, if I wasn't leaving the house, if I was always going to be covered, there would be no need for the warning. You don't need a raincoat if you're not going to one day be around rain.
Or if she had just been like, oh, it's going to rain, don't go out today.
Yeah. So I think the warning that's laid out here does indicate that the picture has always been that we would be around those who are struggling with death, that we'd be active in snatching them away. That's the passage in Jude. And that means we have to be cautious that there is sin that they're working through that easily contaminates. But even then, we have the solution, right? So I think that's what it looks like to touch dead.
Mm-hmm. So that passage in Jude, that verse says, rescue others by snatching them from the flames of judgment. Show mercy to still others, but do so with great caution, hating the sins that contaminate their lives. And I want to sit here for a little bit because I think, kind of to what you were alluding to, I don't think we know how to do this well. Like, I feel like I almost see two sides of the pendulum when it comes to people in the Big C church, but the Western church, just because that's what I know. Like, it's either I am going to completely isolate, I'm going to be so cautious, hating the sin in other people that I'm not ever exposing myself to it. So I don't really know people who aren't following the Lord. Or you've got kind of the other side of like, I'm going to love these people so much, but what kind of happens is that my life doesn't look all that different from theirs, except for how I spend a couple hours on Sunday morning. And I think this passage is really clear that we're to walk somewhere in the middle of that, but I don't think we always know how to do that. So how would you advise someone who's trying to figure out in real time how to live this verse out?
Man, this fortunately and unfortunately, it's not like there's one set way. So you kind of go through scenarios to kind of flesh out for people what this looks like, because we all want to know how far is too far. And I think because now more than ever, the heightened wave in numbers with, let's say, for example, anxiety and mental health, many of us, I think, would kind of refrain from helping certain people that their lifestyles or the things that they go through trigger certain things for them. So then they feel like, I can't really deal with this person because it creates too much triggers for me. And then so you're with so many different scenarios now that I think you have to kind of walk people through so many different ways on how we can actually be there, and reminding them that it's never meant to be an easy process, that I got to learn how to cling to the Spirit, but be present. Like, to go to your point, like, to live with this caution communicates that there's risk in what we do.
Yeah.
So risk is never easy. Risk does feel heightened and sometimes overwhelming, but it doesn't mean that you're walking in a danger zone yet. It just means this is risky.
Yeah.
Tread softly, be smart, but you have to be there, because if you're not there, like, who will be there? So I think it's because people go through so many different things. I think we have to be willing to have detailed conversations and not leave the answer at, well, it really depends what a person's going through. Because I've been a part of conversations that we kind of answered something, but we really didn't at all. We just said, well, it's really hypothetical. So I think it's just taking time to address maybe some scenarios to help us to understand, how do we deal with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I feel like the community is really important here too, because if you're in those moments and those situations where you're helping someone that's going through something, and that sin is there, and it may even be, to John's point, it might be something that you're tempted by or brought into. Having a strong community around you who's able to keep you accountable and keep you in check, and that you're able to communicate with, I feel like helps create that balance to keep you to kind of heed that warning. So
I would go a step further and say, if it's at all possible, connecting the community together. So it's not just like, I've got church friends who are praying for me and they know about other friends that I have, but like, how do I, especially if I know people have the same interests or they're in similar seasons of life, like, how do I invite people to come together so people who don't know the Lord yet are connected to an entire community and not just to me, which also then makes it easier to be cautious and know, there are other people in the room who are trying to honor God in the choices that they're making as well. It can feel weird, like, just all cards on the table. I used to be one of those people that was like, I don't like my worlds to mix. And like, I would just be uncomfortable sometimes. And it was like, but these are my school friends and these are my church friends. And this just feels weird. But the older I get, the more it's just like, no, how can I bring everybody together? Because it is a little bit easier than feeling like I'm just kind of out there.
Yeah, I've kind of navigated an in, not of mentality when it comes to that as a principle that I kind of live by. So I'll give you an easy one. I had a friend who came to the Lord after a season of disobedience, just kind of came back to God, gave his life to the Lord. And, some people like instantly get kind of some relief from some of their addictions. Other people have to work through it. And this one in particular, his issue was cigarette smoking. So he knew he needed to get rid of it. It was just a bad habit. And he just felt like God was asking him to get rid of this thing. But he knew like this was going to be a process. So he went from smoking 2 packs a day to down to smoking 2 cigarettes a day. And so what would happen is we would be hanging out with a group of the guys from the church, and then he would always seem to disappear. And I started questioning, I was like, where's this guy going? And finally, one day I noticed where he went, and I walked out with him, and he sat down on a stump, and I sat down next to him. And we just had a conversation about church or whatever we were talking about. And it sounds silly because he had a cigarette in one hand, trying to walk through this thing. I knew he was struggling with this addiction, but we were talking about other things. And I was in, but I was not of. So like I wasn't engaging in the thing, but I was close to the person who was engaging in the thing. So that's where the challenge, and I believe the balance is set for us as believers. How do we live life alongside people whose lifestyles are different, who has some scarrings from that lifestyle, who are navigating seasons of death? How do we live close enough for them to see the difference in us, but not so close that they can't see it, because we're but you know.
And even to that point, like you're going to smell like cigarette smoke when you come in. Other people may even assume that if you're going outside, what has John Hernandez gotten into? Like he's going taking smoke breaks, and like you have to be okay with knowing the Lord knows what you're doing. Like, I don't know if people were talking about that or judging, but I think we're afraid of that sometimes. Like,
yeah, I think we've done 2 things poorly as a church community, and anybody who would argue this, I think, is arguing a bad point. We've done 2 things badly. We have made judging people, like the judgment of other people, we've made that the heart of our church structure. And then on top of it, we haven't taught people how to judge. So what I mean by that is the scripture is clear that we're to judge, but we're judging according to their fruits. Like that's what, if me and Justin are in good relationship together and I'm holding Justin accountable, I'm seeing the product of his life. Justin can talk a good game, but if his marriage is horrible and it's just producing like, anger and frustration in him, and I'm seeing his wife and I can use them as an example because they're fine. But then that fruit, there's the lack of peace, the lack of joy, the lack of goodness and patience. Like in that lack, if there's not that fruit, I can hold Justin then accountable. That's good, quote unquote, judging, right? Because we are judging the quality of the fruit. We don't teach that as a church structure anymore. Like we've got away from that. So what ends up happening almost naturally is we lean into the toxicity of judgment, which is, I'm not going to know jack about you, but you smell like smoke. So you must mean that I need to avoid you. And then we teach this premise. Like, so then now if I'm avoiding you, I got to tell John that I'm avoiding you so John can avoid you. And I can tell. So we've moved from this biblical perspective of how to navigate good judgment to now we're just gossips, and the whole world. Look, if we're going to judge people because who they were, there's nobody. There's nobody. Like John did a phenomenal job Sunday. I don't have any problem sharing this because he shared it on Sunday with our congregation. But he talked about struggling through some addiction issues, right? Like if you're going to try to cancel John now for that, P.S., I will line every one of my pastors right behind them because we all need to be disqualified. So then, John, what are you telling me I have to judge him by? The scripture's clear by his fruit. Is there love? Is there peace? Is he producing patience in the relationships around him? Is it evident that the Spirit of God is working in him? Then we can trust what God is doing in him. I am not the one that says only God can judge me because that's not biblical. It's just not. But I am called to judge the right thing. So I've never been that guy. Matter of fact, I come from a little bit of that old school, like, someone labeled it legalism. I thank God for it. It really did teach me in seasons that I needed to learn. But where, like, if you walked into a restaurant where there was a bar, you walked out. I get it. I understand it. But then if you get a call at 12 o'clock in the morning from a neighbor who's struggling with his wife and his kids and is calling you drunk from a bar because he needs a ride, you're telling me you're not going to walk there because of some sense of self-holiness that seems, now to John's point, be careful, boundaries, triggers. If you're an alcoholic, probably don't want to walk into a bar. I completely get it. But in the same breath, if we're not willing to risk, if we're not willing to go that extra mile, if we're standing from a distance, isolated in our bubbles and pointing fingers, I just don't think that honors God.
Yeah. Amen.
Sorry, sometimes these podcasts turn
No,
a
I
little
like
bit
it.
into lectures, and I apologize.
And
Good
that's
preaching.
really who you are. Because I remember when I barely knew you, and you were new to what's now Hope City West, and we were just talking about optics. I remember you said, I don't really care about optics, because I was telling you, you know, I'm not going to engage in behavior that dishonors the Lord, but I'm also like out in the world a lot. And you were like, I don't care if someone calls and says, we saw Pastor Ashley at a bar on Wednesday night, as long as I know that I can trust you, that you're making wise decisions. And that has been the case. And I don't think anyone's ever called you. But I remember even in that, not knowing you well at the time, being like, I think that's what Jesus would say. Like, I mean, to be fair, people were mad at Jesus all the time for hanging out with sinners. And I'm not saying everyone in a bar is a sinner, so I don't want that to be like,
Yeah.
but just that idea of,
And again, please hear me. The scripture's clear. With wisdom,
yeah,
like be wise. If you're a 21-year-old man and you're single, and you know a 21-year-old girl is calling you to her apartment in the middle of the night, probably not a good call. Like that's not snatching anybody away
Yeah.
from the fire. That's jumping in it, right? Like you gotta be smart. But in the same breath, like as a church community, we gotta learn what our call is and what our place is. If you're too far from the edge, like the phrase that we kind of if you can't rescue someone you're not willing to touch,
yeah.
like that's just not a thing.
Yeah, I love. So you talked about this word snatching, and we talked about snatching up. You guys all had stories that I realized were kind of life and death situations. Justin, you were
Whitewater rafting.
moronically put in the position of guiding
Yes.
on your second day of whitewater rafting. That moron judgment is for the people who
Yeah.
made this choice. But you
Yep.
had a teenager fall out of the boat, and you had to snatch her back in. You said you hadn't moved that fast in your life. And I was like, I can kind of picture this. You were a 2-year-old walking by a pool who fell in, and thank the Lord that your aunt saw you and she snatched you up by the hair. My running theory is that's why he no longer has hair.
Might be.
And then you were Super Johnny on the second or third story window,
yeah.
and another out the window story.
That's it.
Convinced that you were going to be able to fly, and also an aunt
Yep.
snatched you in and didn't let you fall to.
Or live in my full destiny, whatever one you want to believe.
I would say this tells me that Spanish ants are like
Oh, that's
incredible.
no joke. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the urgency, because I don't think we always feel that. But when we're telling these stories, these are not, oh, well, when she got around to it, she put her stuff down and went out to the pool to get 2-year-old John out of the pool. Or like, oh, well, Justin made sure that everything was good, and then he went back to get this girl who had fallen out of the boat. Like these are life or death in an instant stories. And that's what we're instructed to do, to rescue others by snatching them from the flames. How do we live in that urgency? Just a light question.
I think the early church lived in the urgency because this was a constant conversation. This wasn't a sermon they did once a month. Like this was a regular part of their gathering. They believed that Jesus was coming back. I'm not sure we fully believe that anymore. At least we don't live like it, right? And it wasn't just that he was coming back, is that he could come back tomorrow. And it's crazy because we're thousands of years separated from that point. If you do study in like all of the things that should happen before Jesus comes back, a lot more of those things happen between them and us than between them and when Jesus ascended. What I mean by that is their urgency, that blessed hope they had, they saw every neighbor as, if this happens tomorrow, the consequences of that. Yeah, I had a conversation with somebody recently who's walking through some issues of the faith. And I'm like, well, you know enough about my faith to know that now my urgency changes. Like, you got to know that if I fully believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and the only way to the Father, if I fully believe that at any moment he can come back and be completely justified in doing so, that he's given every warning he said he was going to give and have done everything to make himself known to you, if I truly believe that, I'd be willing to run through walls to get you to understand this, right? So I do think we have grown comfortable, and what was an everyday reality for them has become some kind of theological framework that we believe in but not necessarily live in. And I think that that's the difference. If you're asking me, how do we do that in 2025? I know it sounds crazy, but falling deeper in love with Jesus and more aware of his imminent return.
Mm-hmm. And reminding each other of that.
Yeah.
Isn't that what the Hebrews verse was actually written in the context of? Encourage each other every day, all the more as the day of his return is approaching. That's the Ashley translation. But yeah, that idea that like we need to remind each other, like, hey, I know that neighbor's annoying you, but also eternity's on the line. But it is a change in perspective.
A big deal for the church that like when we said it changed language for them. Like it changed language. It put them all on mission. The way they talked to each other, the way they examined scripture, the way they considered, it was all in light of their eschatology, right? Like their idea of the imminent return of Jesus. And we've just lost sight of that. And I think ultimately, well, John, I'm just not comfortable. Well, if time's an issue, how are you going to wait till you get comfortable? Right? Like if it's really that important, are you, I don't know, that I'm just not wired that way. Okay. But like we're putting your wiring ahead of what? Your neighbor's eternal condition.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember your $1 million line?
I think that's what triggers it all. It is also the comfort, which has caused us to not be like always on the watch. So much time has passed. So, he'll come back soon, but it's not the same urgency. So I think when we're constantly living in that way, it's a challenge for us because, even the time frame, we still use the time frame 2,000 years ago or later. Yeah. I remember saying that when I was in high school in the 90s. Mm-hmm. I'm like, it's still 2,000 years later?
We were rounding up. Now we're rounding down.
But I think, again, what we make as a priority and what we continue to push will tend to shape just our views, our actions, our convictions even. And I think we do have to be that way because, again, even in Romans 12:12, the way God transforms us is by changing the way we think. So if we're not thinking in line of he can come back any day now, truly, then we will always feel like we have another day before we can reach out to someone. So I know so-and-so needs to hear the truth. Today I'm kind of busy. I'll hit them up the next day. And I think it always kind of tends to go back to comfort.
Yeah. And you had this line, you must not have remembered it, but you said your nature is not more powerful than his spirit.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, to the point you were making, we'll say like, oh, that's not my personality, or I'm just not good at that. And there are things that we're more gifted in than others, but there are also clear commands that we're to obey. And so when you said that in the room, literally everyone was like, because we do have to surrender to his spirit.
Yeah. When you're planning to go on a trip, when do you pack? Like literally, are you a couple days ahead?
I usually pack 12 to 24 hours ahead, but I make a list starting maybe 2 weeks ahead. So what I kind of am more focused on, make sure I have everything on this list, and then the actual act of putting it together in the suitcase happens.
What about you, Justin?
That's the end.
Depends on where I'm going.
Yeah.
There's some places, I'll pack a day or so early. There's some places I'll pack the day we're leaving.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, so much of that is a picture of how we approach this idea of evangelism, this idea of reaching the lost or waking the dead. It's like, we got time. And unfortunately, there's two problems with that thing. First of all, you don't know when the plane's coming, right? Mm-hmm. So that's different. But the other thing is, we also make this thing about waking the dead simply about forever and forget the benefits of right now, right? Like family trees being transformed, people waking up out of their addiction and depression, God bringing healing mentally, physically, emotionally, stepping into a pure joy and a pure love. And we say it all the time here, a hope and a purpose. Like those things are made available right now. That's not a forever thing. That's right now. And I do think we have to, and I get it to your point, people are in different places. People struggle with different things and giftings. We have made evangelism this thing that's reserved for the chosen and the chosen few, that there's a small group within the group that this is what they're supposed to do. And I just don't read that biblically. So.
Yeah. Agreed. So hard shift. One of the things that happened right after Eutychus was revived, brought back to life, is that they came back and they ate. And so we spent a long time talking about the significance of the table in the early church, both almost as a piece of furniture, kind of representative of the gathering for the meal, and also as communion. And because that's what we're inviting people into, like, I think it is the natural progression. You don't snatch people from the flames and then just leave them there. What was the significance of the table in Paul and Eutychus's environment? And then we'll move to what it means now. All answers are okay.
I think it definitely represented family. Kind of maybe not as much from the physical mother-father relationship, but that community of family around. We're gathering together and just having those moments at the table, like kind of like we were talking about, like what's your kitchen table look like? It's got the homework, it's got the artwork, it's all these people are there and being represented, and having those moments and surrounded with food. I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
I feel like them gathering as late as they did speaks to the closeness that they must have had. I mean, just not anyone is going to be at your house midnight and up into the early morning time. So even the closeness and the bond that they had to have experienced, and the love for Paul and the message that he was bringing, was clear and evident that they would invest their time into the late morning. Like, that just spoke to how strong and how, I think, united they were in that.
That's true. And there's a vulnerability there. Like, I know my brain just doesn't work as well at night. So the people that I will actually like be around, it is different. It is more of a family feel.
Yeah. Crazy stuff come out late at night. So
yeah, we've all been on staff retreats. I just stopped making sense.
Yeah, that table was critical. It also reminded them what draws them to the table. And, you know, it's not, I think sometimes we get a little infatuated with this idea of community and, oh, well, I have a community of people who are like-minded, so we do the same things together, or we enjoy the same pastime together, and that's what brings us together, or we share even the same blood. That's what brings us together. At this table, what drew them together is to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made available through the breaking of his body and the pouring out of his blood. And then in turn, he's quick to remind us, and now you need to love each other the way that I love you. So that's the premise of that table, to bring us together around the person of Jesus, that we're connected in love like he loves us, that ultimately when people are brought back to life, that there's space made available, they're brought into community. What I love about this story is there's not an in-between time where they prepped this kid, they got him clean, they made sure he was all right, they brought him home, sleep it off, we'll have dinner next week. It very much was, no, bring him to the table because there's still space. And I think that that's a beautiful picture of, the two people he was next to, they were a little dirtier by the time this was done, right? Like the two people who had to make space at that table that were the closest to him had to deal with some of the stench of that death still. And yet, I think that's our call.
Yeah, you talked about this quote from Fleming Rutledge that says, when we come to his table, we're not divided into an A list and a B list. It's one table, one gift, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And it really is like the table is the great equalizer.
Most theologians that or people that I've even read that speak about this issue of communion or the table, it is the great equalizer, because there's one name at the table that's worthy, right? Like it's not about how you got here. It's not, the access point is Jesus. It's the phrase that I used this week was, or we all used this week was, it's not a table by us. It's a table for us. And the access is being made, and he's quick. We are all, there's no man, woman, husband, wife, free, Jew, Gentile. At the foot of the cross, we are all at this place of equality because of who we're standing in front of.
Yeah.
So, P.S. Fleming Rutledge, who I have just discovered and Ashley has known about for a while because she's smarter than I am.
I just come from the same background as she does.
Yeah. We don't agree on everything theologically, but my Lord, that woman did
She's
some
done some deep
work.
thinking.
She's got a book called The Undoing of Death. Come on, somebody. And it came right at the perfect time. So I've been knee deep in all of her sermons over 20 years comprised during the Holy Week. And some of the stuff is just rich with some of that imaging. But
Yeah.
I think as a woman writing, she has insight to some of the equalities that you face as a second tier citizen in the kingdom of God. And really what I love about the table is there's no such thing. It's what unifies us all, regardless what your theology is about women in ministry, regardless what your theology is about different races or different cultures at the table, none of that matters. We are all here for one purpose, brought by one God in one name, gathered for one purpose. So,
So good.
yeah, it's rich.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a thought and I just lost it. Which,
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It doesn't happen often, but I have no idea where I was.
Yeah, these late
about to
afternoon
go with that.
podcasts,
Right.
man. I have to caffeine up.
Yeah, feeling like Eutychus, like
That's
gonna
it.
fall asleep. And I'm on a stool, so I may fall backwards. I feel like there was, to some level, a practical call to this. Like we kind of, I want to say spiritualize, but it is spiritual. This idea of communion and coming and being part of the fellowship of the church is like symbolically being invited to his table. But I think to the point that all of you guys made, there is also something about gathering with people around a table in your home that is different from just getting together for coffee. I can't remember. All your sermons are running together in my head. Is that a fair thing to say, that this may be a challenge for us to, as we're trying to figure out how to come close to those who are dead in a spiritual sense? Like there is a call to bring people to the table, not just like come to church on Sunday, but come be at the table with me.
Yeah, just for clarity though, because I think there's an important distinction. There's the process of communion, and then they were eating supper together. Those two things were separate, although they did it very much at the same time. Like it's like they got together for the Lord's Supper and then they ate. And the reason for that distinction is communion is different than the power that God can use, I believe, at your table. There's something that happens when you break bread with people. I just believe that. This is the part where I would argue the communion has a very, very rigid guideline in Scripture. This is what communion looks like. This is what it looks like to do it. If you do communion without the body, you're not really doing communion. If you do communion without the blood, you're not really doing communion. If you do communion and you're restricting people from the table, I would argue to some degree, regardless of, I know that there's some differences there based off of religious backgrounds, but there's Scripture really outlines what that looks like. Supper, not so much, right? Like, hey, we ate together, right? So I think there is a freedom to say, hey, we're going to have people over to the house for dinner. I've always felt like there's a power around your dinner table. My wife and I, in several seasons of life, would open our home up to people we knew, people we didn't know, people we wanted to get to know. And I think there's a power in that. I believe that the Holy Spirit that meets us in communion can very much meet us at our table. Because what I feel like naturally happens is when we do life alongside people, they start asking that question, right? That's why Scripture is clear, to make sure you have an answer for that question of the hope that we found in Jesus. So I say that to say, I just want to make sure that there's a clear distinction here, but absolutely I believe in the power of the dinner table. Absolutely I believe in the power of a coffee table. I would argue...
That's good because I don't have a dinner table.
I would argue there's power in a pickleball court if it's done with the right mindset and the right heart. There's power in going to a kid's baseball game. Like there's investment into relationship that I believe absolutely the Spirit of God can use. Now again, for clarity, communion is communion, and that's done within the family of believers in the company of believers. I also think you can do family communion, like that stuff is also well and good, completely well and good. But there is some power in that table too.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I always live in food. There's something about
Come on, somebody.
There's a personal thing about being surrounded with people that you may love or not love or know or not know, but yet you're sharing food, because there is a physical and emotional thing about food in and of itself, and now this is a shared experience. And I think, I mean, how many times through the Bible do we see that there was food involved in something? Almost, I feel like so many miracles have food involved in them. And I just always feel like there's something about that feeding of our body that also is part of feeding of our soul as well.
There's a vulnerability to it, like you mentioned earlier also, like how I eat, what I eat, that conversation, like there's some vulnerability there.
Yeah, and I think for people that may be a little bit hesitant to this table idea, I think reminding yourself that there is a vulnerability to this table thing. So maybe start at a local coffee spot before you bring them in your house at your table. Because I wouldn't just want to go to anyone's table if I don't know you yet, me personally. While someone else would love it, I would kind of want to get to know you first on some safe, neutral grounds to see, do I want to go next level and be in their house? And so I do think just thinking about that just shows the weight behind that time that you invest with someone at the table. So maybe if you're not ready to open up your home to a complete stranger because, your mind races, I don't know who this person is, get to know them by finding some middle ground and meet in the spaces that you feel more comfortable, embracing that concept so that you, again, don't allow comfort to dictate what it is that you do.
Mm-hmm.
You just make the efforts and the steps that you can now. So maybe, meet at a coffee spot, meet at Mickey D's. Their French fries are bomb.
I like the new Chick-fil-A fries.
Do you? Still
but
haven't
some people
had it
don't.
Yet. I still haven't had it yet. I need to try it, though.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I also think, I feel like I'm always talking about this, but there is something about proximity, and it's easier for neighbors to pop into your home or sit on your front porch. Or I know not everyone is a city person, but I don't know how many times in the last year I've thanked God for the fact that I live in an apartment, because I have neighbors, I don't even have to walk outside to see them, and our homes are laid out exactly the same. So like there is I know that sounds silly, but there's a little bit of a built-in level of comfort where you're like, I know where the bathroom is because it's exactly where it is at my place.
Yeah.
I know I can get out really easily if this is not a great situation because I live right on the other side of that wall. But yeah, to that idea of sharing a table, absolutely find those people that you get along with and from work or other places that may not live close to you. But don't miss out on the people that God has orchestrated to have as your neighbors in this season. And it is easier.
Yeah, I think to that point, we have complicated that word neighbor. Neighbor is the person who's close to you. So if you're at work and you have a cubicle of someone who's close, that's your neighbor, right? If you're at school and you're sitting on a desk and the person has the desk, that's your neighbor. So people who are in close proximity, that's your neighbor. And that's the call, that we would love our neighbor. And starting there, I think is huge. I think it's absolutely huge. We're getting to know our neighbors, and Jess and I have actually been talking literally about this. Like, how do we, to your point, like we've not really known them. An invitation to the house seems a little weird. Maybe we do an outside barbecue in our yards touch. So they might be cool with, that type of setup before I'm inviting them over the house. But what it can't do is keep us from, and this is what I hope that God people pull away from this message. Like, it's too important for these type of things to keep us from doing the work that's necessary to introducing people to Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're coming up on an hour. Cutting room floor, either for this podcast, something that we didn't get to from the message, or something that you didn't get to from your study that didn't make it into the message. Anything for the cutting room floor?
I'm going to pull a John Gonzalez this time and say, no, I'm good.
I'm going to second that.
I'm only going to point one out because you pointed it out to me last night. Was that in our pre-service meeting that we sat down with our staff, not our staff, but our volunteers and all that, and walked through, I just kind of hit that mentality of like, it's a Sunday morning. It's 8 a.m. It's 8:30. It's 9 o'clock. We're tired. You're worn out. We're all in this room together. And that concept that like we can look at the story and go, yeah, this guy fell asleep, but that kind of is all of us. But that's okay. We keep pushing through and we keep moving through. And I think that would have been fun to dissect a little bit more.
Yeah.
The concept of, part of me wants to say poor Eutychus. I feel like he was set up to fail or to fall, literally, you know. But it's okay too.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, that is good. No one was like, what were you doing? Paul was just like, he's alive. Let's eat.
And finish this message. We gonna finish this message.
Still got another 6 hours to go.
Yeah.
Man, I'm
Could
glad
you
I live in
imagine
this
preaching
time.
for 6 hours? And that's half this message, because basically he falls at midnight,
Yeah.
and then he goes till dawn. So let's just pretend that's 6 a.m. 6-7 hours, and that's before. I mean, he had already preached all day. Like, that's a long message.
I love that you're thinking about it from a preaching perspective. My thought goes right to, I can't imagine sitting and listening to teaching for
I
that
don't know.
long.
If
Are we
it's
sure
Paul,
Eutychus didn't?
I don't know. I think I'd be asleep.
come
but
on,
we
if
all
it's
know
Paul,
about
be
10
like, this is
o'clock,
my
my brain
bad the whole
shuts off.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't even talk for that long about nothing. I'm tired.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where are we headed?
We are headed to Palm Sunday.
Woo.
Yeah, you know, we're taking a little bit of a different approach to this whole Holy Week and talking about geography. I feel like I'm in 8th grade all over again. The places where all this happens just speaks volumes. You know, Jesus makes this statement, and I'm literally this just hit my head now. He makes this statement that you know, they're worshiping him, and the religious leaders at the time are like, you got to tell him to stop. And his response is, well, if they stop, the rocks will cry out. I think that we're spending time listening to the rocks this week, right? Like, what does it say that Jesus walked the same route that they paraded the sheep for sacrifice on? What does it say that he found himself at the Garden of Gethsemane surrounded by olive trees, where olives were made for the crushing? What does it say that a place defined by death is where they would place him, right? Golgotha, the place of death. What would it say that that's the place that he redefines life and breaks robs hell in that moment? Like, what does it say that each one of these steps were intentional, they were purposeful, and I do believe preach a message to where we are today. So that's the hope, and we start this Sunday.
We do. It's finally Holy Week. I feel like
It's upon
we've
us.
been waiting forever. So we want you to join us, but we also want you to invite your friends, specifically if you're part of the Hope City family. We've been praying over some people for almost 8 weeks now. We talked about interceding, investing. Now is the time to be inviting. So hopefully you've got some of those invite cards. You can invite them to be with us Palm Sunday at 9 and 11 at both of our expressions. We can't wait to see you then.